The following program, a Moore Report documentary entitled The Quiet Crisis, was originally broadcast in September of 1980.
As a boy, swifter feet took this same path nearly every day, to the boats and the nets. Albert Cavanaugh became a fisherman and, like his father, the pride and provider of his Ojibwe people. Long before him, the Egyptians, the Vikings, the Romans, Asian seafarers, and the merchants of the Mediterranean lived much the same way, stirring the waters for a living. But for Albert, water has always meant more than just trade and transportation, or the pathway of discovery. To him, this is a moody friend, a spirit that breathed life into his people. Now, in the twilight of a lifetime lasting most of this century, Albert's people face a clouded future. Many Ojibwe pick only memories from their nets, and in their native tongue, they have a new phrase, Nikubiche Nibe, meaning the poisoned water. Poisoned in this part of Canada by mercury from a paper mill, but more so by our own collective disrespect, our casual regard. And yet, in terms of sheer numbers, the Earth is an overcrowded ship. 3/4 of the world lacks available fresh water. Atmospheric pollution tampers with temperatures and climates. Deserts silently creep, with the Sahara growing by an area twice the size of Maryland every year. In the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, droughts ravage water supplies, turning the search for food into a pitiful fight. What water is available is often crusty with contamination, and like an unwelcome guest, death paces uncomfortably. Most of the water in the world, some 99% in fact, is undrinkable, seasoned with salt or locked in the polar ice caps. But even in North America, where most of the world's fresh water lies, we too may be unwittingly adrift on the edge of a not-too-distant storm. Christine Olsinius, coordinator of the Freshwater Society.
There are officials in the federal government that have said that by the mid-1980s, water in this country will be more of a concern than energy is today.
Since the Second World War, 2 major droughts have choked much of our farmland with a grip even more frightening than the Dust Bowl days. Our major river system, the Ohio, the Mississippi, the Colorado, and the Hudson, are weary with abuse. We have drained millions of acres of valuable wetlands, and witnessed the near-fatal poisoning of Lake Erie. In New York's Adirondack Mountains, half of the lakes no longer have fish, soured with acid rains and snow. Nuclear wastes haunt the bays of San Francisco. And thousands of chemical cauldrons boil restlessly around us like the porridge of a witch.
I think we need to start doing something about our water problems now before they get totally out of control and we have a major crisis on our hands.
Love canal is now the all-too-common call word of either real or potential tragedy. But as a public health controversy, it is merely symptomatic. Thousands of new chemicals are introduced every year, and illegal dump sites block the countryside, creating a chorus of public outcry.
We're having more and more local situations where you have real danger to the public health.
People are demanding more and more water.
And we live in the illusion that we're water rich.
Most people don't even know where their water comes from. They turn on the faucet. They don't know.
Once you pollute groundwater, what will it cost to improve it?
The boy upstairs isn't going to say, well, you destroyed all that water, we'll give you a whole new batch. He doesn't do that. So we're going to have to take care of it ourselves.
In this high technology world of ours, water is indeed the premium blend. And it's only recently that we have begun to understand just how we use water and how much we actually use. In the early part of this century, we used only a tiny fraction of the total rain and snowfall on this continent. Now we're using almost 3/4 of the water we receive. How? To make it through the typical day, with bacon and eggs for breakfast, the morning paper, a ride to work in a 2-ton car, a noontime sandwich, some pop in a tin can, and a steak dinner to come home to, each of us uses a whopping 2,000 gallons, 4 times as much as the average European. But what's pushing us closer and closer to the limits of our available supply is not our individual domestic use, or the traditional heavy industries, steel making and manufacturing, but our seemingly unquenchable appetites for food and fuel. To satisfy the thirst of food and energy production, as well as growing urban centers, we have rearranged the paths of countless rivers. The Missouri, the Columbia, and almost every major river in the Southeast. We have so manipulated and drawn upon the Colorado that its mighty roar is a mere trickle by the time it reaches the Gulf. And now, planners muse about water pipelines to push Alaskan waters toward Los Angeles, Lake Erie to the big eastern cities, and Lake Superior, the largest body of fresh water in the world, all the way down through the agricultural belly of mid-America. Never has food production depended so heavily on water. New varieties of corn and wheat, which feed much of the world, need monstrous insect-like irrigation systems, the sprinklers in our agricultural backyards. As an industry, agriculture is now the largest consumer of water, using about 80% of the fresh water taken in the United States. In California, 9 out of 10 gallons are consumed by agriculture. And much of this is lost through evaporation.
In the western part of the United States, there's a major crisis brewing over just trying to get enough water for use, for agriculture, for industry, and for residences.
Most of our water is under the ground, moving slowly through what are called aquifers. And along the stitch and seam of mid-America, one major groundwater system, the Ogallala Aquifer, is on the verge of drying up. The withering Ogallala system, should it go dry, will forever wrinkle the face of agribusiness, from the Dakotas to Texas. Energy, too, now rides the back of water. Coal and nuclear plants, gasification and synthetic fuel systems, all of these will drain record amounts of water in the rest of this century. In the Dakotas, Alaska, the Northwest, the heart of a new energy frontier, water is already the most valuable and vulnerable ingredient. Years ago, oil and gas were plentiful and cheap. And hydroelectric power, which merely used the force of water and returned it to the stream, lit up the landscape with a constant surge. But today, our energy policies and products rest upon the huge nuclear and coal-fired power plants, the so-called megawatt and megabuck systems. Like runners in a marathon, these powerful plants need huge amounts of water just to keep cool. And like the runner, who continually drips with sweat, most power plants lose much of their water to the wind through evaporation. But the problem with coal-fired power plants, especially older ones, which still produce most of our electricity, centers around the gases they release. Most scientists believe these gases mix with water in the atmosphere to produce a rather bitter cocktail.
Acid rain and increasing consumption of fossil fuel, those two things taken together, that is changing the atmosphere by increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and also the problem of increased acidification, that those two things taken together, that's certainly the major environmental problem that we have to face internationally.
Dr. John Wood is an internationally acclaimed scientist working with the Gray Freshwater Biological Institute at the University of Minnesota.
There are 273 lakes in Canada which are susceptible to acid rain, where the acid rain is ruining the lakes. And this is occurring primarily as a consequence of smelting of ore and burning of coal. Now, the problem is, how do you put a price on 273 lakes?
In some ways, acid rain is a vinegary, powerful solvent. Often bitter to the taste, acid rains, much like lemon juice, can dissolve metals, monuments, and boulders, eat away car paint, and in time, perhaps, will impede the rebirth of soils, forests, and fish. With a sudden spring flush of an acidy snowmelt, for instance, millions of young fish can die within days. Worldwide, there is some dispute about the cause and the source of acid rain. The electric utility industry says emissions from coal-fired power plants are not to blame. The evidence, they argue, is confusing and inconclusive. But within the scientific community, there is a growing consensus that acid rain does come from the burning of fossil fuels, from power plants and car exhaust, in other words.
As I travel and talk to scientists in other parts of the world, Europe and Russia and elsewhere, there's a general agreement that this is a major environmental problem.
Scientists also believe acid rains will have a damaging impact on the oceans. As the oceans become more acidic, we might see changes in the climate of the globe, making the world a hotter and drier place.
And increasing the temperature would cause the ice caps to melt and could cause really disastrous changes in the climate and disastrous changes in water levels.
But for Dr. John Rudd, a scientist with the Freshwater Institute at the University of Manitoba, our most immediate concern should be the precious promise of North America.
It's probably the most serious threat that lakes have ever had. I don't think there's any doubt that if something's not done, there'll be thousands of lakes that before too many years will be completely lifeless.
In Norway, half of the brown trout population is gone, and nearly 3/4 of the lakes have few, if any, fish, seriously upsetting the communities that sprang up around them. Kjell Dasnes, a Norwegian school teacher, remembers his boyhood.
When I was a youngster, we could catch fish in many streams, but when I come back home now, most of the streams are without fish. And more of the inland lakes got dead. There are no fish in them, no trout. Some fish can stay, but not that salmon fishes. It's the acid rain.
In North America, many lakes lack a good buffering capacity. In other words, they don't have the Alka-Seltzer-like ingredients to neutralize the upsets of acid rain and snow. Our use of coal will triple by the end of the decade. Hundreds of new plants will be built. Emissions are expected to double. And in Canada and the U.S., some 50,000 lakes may ultimately be affected. Many of them in the Lakeland Gardens, the tourist areas we cherish most.
And more recently, it's been recognized that there are a large number of lakes in Canada and in North America, and also in Sweden and Norway, where the pH is falling by about 1/10 of a unit a year, that they're becoming strongly acidic. And the predictions are that within about 10 years' time, without any sort of treatment, they'll be so acidic that fish will be unable to reproduce there. Many organisms will be unable to live.
There's another little bigger.
As far as the scientific yardstick is concerned, the monitoring, the testing, the arguing about acid rain has just begun. But long before the voice of science, we listen to the mutterings of common sense.
This here is a last year's frog, so he'd be a year old.
Since he was 8, Gib Edstrom has picked frogs. And not for fun, mind you, or the frying pan, but for medical research. Frogs are commonly used to study the life of the cell, and they're becoming harder and harder to find.
They're dying. They either die in the grain fields before the harvesting, or they die when they hit the water.
The shortage is serious enough worldwide to have prompted some important research. And Gib now works with a national research team to find out why the frogs are dying.
This here's a female. She'd possibly go out if she'd live and lay, 100, 200 eggs, maybe 400 or 500 eggs. But I doubt if that one will ever get to do that.
As far as the study group is concerned, the verdict is still out. But Gib has his own speculations.
Pesticides or chemicals that's used on the grain and in the fields. It washes in. Or either it could be from the clouds above. Acid rain. It's very, very possible, and I think it will eventually, some one way or the other, get to us too, the human race.
Gib Edstrom is no expert by any means. There's no label, no degree, no fancy title you can pin on him. You may dismiss him if you like, or you may take him at his word when he tells us something is wrong. Whatever your reaction, Gib works with a research team because many people, expert or not, data without data, already agree with him. Now, whether we're talking about water shortages in California and New York, toxic waste in Love Canal, or acid rain in the Northeast, what's at stake in all of this is the quality of human life, the character of our global village. You see, when we left the 70s, we left the age of water pollution. Dirty, messy water, tires, bottles, boots, cans, with a gooey sludge topping. What we're in now, and we're in it knee-deep, is a much more complex era, what health officials refer to as the age of contamination. Around us whirl the quicksands of abuse, while above us wave the hands that tell us there's nothing wrong. And all the while, we continue to sink deeper and deeper and deeper. Chemical poisonings, birth defects, cancer, and other illnesses will be the plagues of the 21st century, the headlines of the future, and controversial ones indeed. Health officials will argue, citizens will cry wolf, and both government and industry alike will cry uncle, pinned to a legal and moral mat by the weight of charge and countercharge. Twilight in any town, USA, a quietly growing city, sleeps on the outskirts of rural America. Settled near the shores of Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota, where the Mississippi begins its slippery ride to the Gulf, Bemidji is a bustling vacation mecca and the first urban center along the most important waterway in America. But for more than 20 years now, the city has also been the stage for a bitter water fight, not too unlike those popping up all over the country.
We've been in this for 7 years. There are some people that have been in this for 10 and 12 years.
Cy Polozinski, a teacher, and Marlon Bueller, a neighbor and a farmer, are adamantly resisting the city's attempt to put sewage into an on-land lagoon atop a hidden sea of valuable groundwater.
10 years down the road, we're looking at this thing to be a 5,000-acre monster. and there goes Memorial Headwaters State Forest. There goes the land to recreate upon. There goes our forest and timber products that are on this land, which the economy of this county is based on.
It may not be improvable. It might take many, many years of Mother Nature's work to improve groundwater.
With the prospects of the nearby sewage hole, Cy and Marlin are worried about the landscape, odors, and property values. But they also fear for the groundwater.
I think it's a resource we better protect. And particularly in this area, we're sitting on a vast amount of underground water. Who knows who may need that besides ourselves someday?
Like those in so many growing American cities, Bemidji's sewage treatment plant is a dinosaur with a limp. Outdated, outmoded, and unable to withstand the onslaught of more and more people. In the U.S., the Environmental Quality Council has identified urban sewage treatment as a high-priority water issue. Thousands of communities will have to tear down, rebuild, or update sewage treatment plants. And some years ago, in an attempt to keep sewage out of its own lake, the city of Bemidji moved its discharge pipe downstream, directly into the Mississippi River.
The effluent coming out of that pipe was just abominable. You couldn't believe how...
John Enghauser is one of the leaders in the fight to stop the flushing into the Mississippi and a chain of lakes downstream. What prompted his action was the personal discovery of a major fish kill.
The algae and weed growth had been so great in here because of the effluent coming from the sewer plant that when that algae and weed growth was rotting in the wintertime, it absorbed all of the oxygen, so there was no oxygen for the fish.
But the most devastating impact of the sewage issue may be on the hunting, the fishing, and the wild rice harvesting of the Leech Lake Indians downstream from the city. Ed Fairbanks, a member of the Leech Lake Band.
There used to be a wild rice bed in the river just above Wolf Lake. But because of reasons that apparently nobody's proven, there's no longer a wild rice bed there. There's a giant cattail bed there that serves very little purpose as far as food supply. Water is basically the lifeline or the lifeblood of any people. Hunting, fishing, harvesting, it's a way of life. If you don't have it, you don't have a culture. You just don't have, people. Our fear is that if it isn't cleaned up and if it isn't reversed, if the sewage is not taken out of the water and put into good use, or put somewhere else where it can be utilized, that it's going to kill our lakes.
The mayor of Bemidji, Doug
right.
Peterson.
That is their concern, and it should be noted that that is the city's concern as well.
Bemidji has proven that they really cannot be the leader, they cannot correct this problem. And we're not a bunch of radicals up here, we're only trying to solve the problem. And it's not only theirs now, they've gotten so big that it's ours, and it's affecting our way of life.
For its part, the city says it is interested in the livelihoods of resort, property owners, and Indians downstream. And when ordered to do so, Bemidji did move its discharge pipe out of the Mississippi. But the city still wants on-land sewage disposal. Some studies say on-land treatment is unsafe and won't work. Resistance is still strong. And so, like many communities, Bemidji faces the likelihood of an expensive new treatment facility, which could push water bills as high as $30 a month. Besides a rather rude awakening to the future costs of water, sewage and waste disposal issues such as this have drawn attention to the many groundwaters that sneak around underneath us and the wetlands that nap up above. With secrets all its own, a wetland is what most of us perhaps irreverently call a swamp or a marsh. But it is the most ancient of cathedrals, with life in the shadows, hushed prayers, and a hidden choir. Since the Second World War, we have plowed over, dug up, filled in, and flattened millions of acres of wetlands all across America for shopping centers, malls, schools, roads, office buildings, and condo complexes. And with the turn to high-technology farming, farmers often feel the pressure to plant more, sell more, and make more, leaving much of the prairie flat and dry.
Today's farming leaves a mostly sterile environment, too. When it is plowed and worked and sprayed. At best, it's a monoculture, which is not attractive to wildlife. And at worst, the physical destruction of the nests and the young and the place that they have to live, it just doesn't leave a place for wildlife to live.
Bill Bryson is an exception, a farmer who fought to save his wetlands.
I know that we used to have lots of wetlands, even when I was young. When I was in high school in the early 40s, we had lots of wildlife, we had lots of wetlands, and now you walk to any of those places and there's nothing left. It's a desert compared to what it used to be with regard to wildlife.
In many states, wetlands are protected. In others, they are not. Even here in Minnesota, where strict permit requirements are in effect, there are exceptions. And with a road in mind, the county condemned Bryson's wetland, not knowing he would resist.
I wanted to save something if I could, and show that we could save something if I could. Show perhaps that our court system would allow you to save something. I wasn't setting out to be a rabid environmentalist or cause a lot of waves, but I was trying to preserve something that I hate to see disappear from our American scene and think is worth preserving and that we should preserve.
Bryson eventually won his fight, but not after 10 expensive years and 2 trips to the state Supreme Court. Legal bills still hang over him, but his work now is more tranquil.
Well, I like the wildlife that is around the marsh. I like the aesthetics, the quiet, the sounds, the quiet when it's quiet, and the sounds of the birds and the animals that are here when they are here. And at night, when I'm done in the field, I will shut off the tractor and just sit and listen to hear what is here that night.
The value of wetlands, though, goes beyond the lonely call of the wild. Wetlands are absorption pads for torrents of runoff, carrying lead and a catalog of chemicals that ripple our highways. In another sense, they are organic rain barrels, welcoming and holding water to prevent soil erosion and flooding. Conservation officials concede that thousands of acres of wetlands are illegally drained every year. And as we lose them, we lose the sieves and strainers in Mother Nature's kitchen, the filters that catch the increasing number of chemicals that farmers use.
A marsh is the best water purification system that we have because the vegetation in a marsh will use up the pollutants and nutrients that are in the water, utilize it and tie it up in vegetation and break it down to a harmless form. So the marshes provide a lot of values.
Farming is perhaps North America's biggest and most important industry. And like any high-technology operation, steel making, oil refining, power and auto production, farming has a major effect on the environment, especially the water.
You see, the major polluter in the world is the farmer.
Farming, you'll recall, is the most thirsty consumer of water in North America. And for biochemist Dr. John Wood, it is yet another perplexing technology, one that may be having a questionable impact on the water we drink.
Most of the pollution problems in our freshwater systems, drinking water systems, are a consequence of agricultural activities, the distribution of fertilizers and pesticides and insecticides and you name it. And this stuff gets into the water, it goes through the water treatment process, and the net result is that we're treating water which is of poorer and poorer quality for human consumption.
Christine Volz is a nurse and mother of 3. Like the homes of many families that have moved from city to country, her house is surrounded by farms, and Christine believes that agricultural runoff has burned her lawn away. She also believes runoff is the cause of chronic health problems.
The doctor then at that time thought that it was still the flu and to continue drinking fluids, so I did. And then by March 15th, I had such tightness in my throat and all the muscles, and I couldn't walk by then. So he said that it looked like all the muscles in my body were just getting so weak. So he thought then of poisoning.
Preliminary studies did show dangerously high levels of bacteria from animal waste and nitrates from farm fertilizer in Christine's well. At first, her doctor believed Christine's problems were water-related. But the Mayo Clinic says there is no conclusive link between her health, her water, and farm chemicals. Despite the medical controversy, health officials warned Christine about the water.
We have to buy my drinking water, and we have to go 5 miles to get our water to cook with and to drink with and to wash clothes. I have to take a bath and do all my washing my hair and everything at the neighbors.
The fertilizer, the pesticides, the herbicides and so forth wash off in this water and then just get carried directly into the groundwater here.
Dr. Calvin Alexander, a geologist with the University of Minnesota, is dye tracing the direction, flow, and subtle exchanges between surface and groundwater systems in Iowa and southeastern Minnesota. Resembling a World War II battlefield, the terrain here is pockmarked with what are called sinkholes, where soft limestone has given way to the whims of moving water. Surgent springs come and go, rivers twist and turn and disappear, and the geological rule of thumb here is what goes down must come up.
And given a situation like this where the water simply runs off the fields and then runs down into holes in the ground, it can and does wind up in people's drinking water.
Thousands of years ago, glacial melt flushed through this area, cutting and carving holes and caverns with the master hand of a sculptor. Most groundwater does not resemble these subterranean fountains. Rather, it moves through gravel and sand like a string of endless beads. But a quarter of the U.S. is cave or karst area like this, with much of it cutting under and through the agricultural belt. In Florida, Missouri, Texas, Kentucky, and Tennessee, serious health problems abound. And in southeastern Minnesota, Christine Volz is not alone.
And then the public health and the DNR came down and they took water tests several different times.
Testing and data gathering is still incomplete, but various studies indicate many of the wells here, perhaps as many as 80%, have been contaminated at one time or another. And areas such as this may show unusually high numbers of health problems in years to come.
This is not a scientific problem. It's a problem of common sense and social conscience.
With human health in mind, Dr. Alexander's laboratory is not Mother Nature's backyard pool, but her basement sump pump. His team straddles, crawls, and jumps for miles through a damp dungeon, searching for glacial memories of how old water is and how it moves, when, where, and why.
13,000 years ago, the water was flowing this way, up here. Now it's flowing the opposite direction, down a little lower. And so it changes with time.
To find and chart a stream entombed in the underworld, Jody Milski eases her way into a crevice barely wide enough for the average human being. Few people have ever descended here, and Jody's purpose is to map the flow, depth, and direction of water that enters this cave within days or even hours after a heavy rain.
Jody?
Yeah.
Going off belay.
Okay.
As a geologist responsible for some pioneering survey work, Dr. Alexander and his team search for answers to a challenging question. How old is the water that travels beneath us?
Well, I'm down at the level of the water now, and it seems to be at least a foot deep, maybe more.
Is the crevice to the east big enough that you can walk along it on the mud bank?
Our Earth holds some 30 times as much water underground as on the surface. 3/4 of all metro areas in America now draw their water from the Earth's bloated belly. And if Jody or others should find that much of this water is glacial melt, and therefore thousands of years old, we may, in effect, be mining water. In other words, it's possible that we're drawing upon ancient finite deposits, like veins of ore or coal. And as we use more and more water, someday perhaps we'll hit the bottom of the barrel. And even in those parts of the world where groundwater is replenished quickly, will the water be as pure as the ice and snow melt of eons ago? For Dr. Alexander, a more immediate concern is how activities on the surface tamper with the quality of water below. North of where he works, a storage tank holding liquefied cattle manure ruptured, killing fish along 16 miles of this river before disappearing into underground springs. Numerous other fish kills threaten prime trout waters, and stocking is a constant ritual. In a tiny town of 300, a sewage lagoon holding waste from a turkey processing operation simply disappeared one day like bathwater. Who knows where it went?
I like to plan for my future and for my children's future, and I'd like to think that their children will have a future.
Mary Ellen Kirsch, housewife, mother, and author of a book about her 3-year fight to stop construction of a hog feedlot near her home.
What we have to realize is that we're not sitting on an infinite filter. We're sitting on a finite sponge. Everything that goes on the surface is collected below. We don't have any filtering capacity, so it goes in. And once that occurs, there's no way of retrieving it, no way that's known to retrieve it. So you're talking about expense to begin with. But more than that, you're talking about life and death situations.
Hog and cattle feedlots generate tremendous amounts of waste. In a single day, feedlots in this county alone produce as much waste as a city of 2 million people. Eventually, health officials and a hearing board agreed with Mary Ellen. The lots posed a potentially serious threat to the water and the people in the area.
We've got a tremendous amount of groundwater. It's pure, it's delicate, but it's there, and rather than dumping on it and saying, well, eventually it'll clear up, I think we should think about the possibility that what if it doesn't?
Ultimately, the impact of groundwater contamination is on our waterways and the oceans. Groundwater does not sit still like an encrusted pool. Rather, it silently seeps into our rivers and streams. And though it moves slowly, it nonetheless moves with the certainty of passing time. So because we share a common backyard and plumbing system, problems in one part of the country are, in the long run, problems for all of us. More and more of the water we drink is the water that rises from the ground. In the Southwest, we've drawn up so much groundwater that areas around Houston and Phoenix are literally sinking. But the issue here goes beyond simply taking more than we receive. The issue here is tampering with and contaminating what is now our most important water reserve, both east and west, groundwater. Underground contamination knows no boundaries. It sees no signposts. It heeds no warning. Contamination moves at will, travels with the silent twists and deadly sting of a snake. Spring water, for bathing, bottling, blending whiskey, or bubbling beer, is now just as questionable as the water in Lake Erie, in the Mississippi, or in your own bathtub. And this hallowed earth of ours is now more perhaps aptly named the killing ground. So the question Mary Ellen Kirsch asked a moment ago is indeed an important one. What do we do if water can no longer cleanse itself as it percolates down through the dirty earth? And what about the Midwestern community where Mary Ellen lives, threatened by both agricultural runoff and a recently uncovered hazardous waste site? Does she move away, or is there no more away? And what about countless other communities? Long Island, Massachusetts, Virginia, suburban Minneapolis, Texas, California. Already these areas hide in the shadows of a chemical ghost. They are the scars of our industrial and agricultural revolutions. With human help, the price we seem willing to pay for the good life. So what lies underneath us is a delicate heritage. And like mischievous, unappreciative children, we're toying with the most fragile gift in the universe. A gift we take for granted, but one forever sacred to the North American Indian. And should we destroy it, it will be, in the words of the Indian, a gift no one can give us again. His home is northern Ontario, and his people the Ojibwe, known for their lyrical language, artistry, and knowledge of the woods. The oldest member of his village, Albert Cavanaugh, has felt both the pride and the pain, the hope and the hopelessness of his people, and he has met the face of progress. Over an 8-year period, a paper mill and an adjacent chemical plant in Dryden, Ontario, released 20 pounds of mercury a day into a part of the English Wabigoon River system, not far from Albert's home. Some 20 tons of mercury moved downstream into prime tourist waters and the fishing grounds of 2 Ojibwe villages. The mayor of Dryden and former paper plant manager Tommy Jones.
The mill knew that they were losing mercury to the river. As far as they were concerned, as far as the best scientific advice was concerned that they had, it was an inert metal, and it went to the river, and that was all there was to it.
But that's hardly all there was to it. Research by Swedish and Japanese scientists had already documented the hazards of mercury. The research had been translated and published in English and was readily available to the scientific community. And 7 years after the dumping began, a Norwegian scientist studying Canadian bird life found mercury in both birds and fish. A deadly toxic substance, mercury riddles the nerve tissue of both animals and humans. Almost immediately, a scare pierced the Canadian air, beginning a series of conflicts, charges, countercharges, and bitter accusations that continue to this day. Biochemist Dr. John Wood first traced the chemistry of mercury poisoning.
But in the middle of all this, we have a public health problem, and a very serious one. And in fact, at a recent meeting that I attended in Germany, World Health Organization meeting, the problem on the English river system was recognized by the World Health Organization and a group of scientists from all over the world as a major environmental problem, and it's regarded as a mercury disaster.
In the 1950s, a Japanese plastics plant dumped mercury into Minamata Bay, launching a twisted, tangled legacy of death and disease. Nearly 800 cases of mercury poisoning were diagnosed. 100 people died, mostly the poor who unknowingly ate poisoned fish and sold it commercially for a meager living. 17 years of denial, legal deception, court cases, and a final admission of guilt resulted in an $84 million settlement. Minamata became a warning to the rest of the world, but the alert went largely unheard. Similar tragedies occurred in Iraq, Mexico, Ghana, Guatemala, and the U.S. Another 4,000 died, and more than 41,000 remain crippled, broken, and forgotten.
Japan has been a very interesting case to show you what extreme industrialization can do to the public health. In that country, they can only eat limited amounts of fish because of mercury concentrations in fish. It's a tragedy because Japan has been a fish-eating nation. It no longer is a fish-eating nation.
In Canada, mercury did show up in the people of Grassy Narrows and White Dog, 2 Ojibwe reserves downstream from the paper mill. Mercury levels in the river were found to be the highest in the world, 17 times higher than the current safe level. And in some people, blood and hair samples contained 3 times the mercury levels found in Japan. After the discovery, the government immediately cut off the source of the mercury, reducing the discharge to a trickle. Tourists were warned about the fishing, and all commercial fishing was stopped, choking the lifeline of the Ojibwe. But to this day, a medical controversy brews.
Because in fact, there has not been, and this is covered by a recent health report from the federal government, there has not been a health effect from mercury in the Wabigoon River system.
And when you also look at the blood mercury levels, they're way above average. And so one can say, well, the Indians have got more mercury in their blood than they should, that they have a loss of lateral vision, which is a symptom of Minamata disease. And I think if you look at the statistics on that, you're convinced that they are suffering from low levels of mercury poisoning, Minamata disease, as a consequence of fish consumption.
The more noticeable symptoms of the disease, though, might not show up for another 20 years, and testing continues. Josephine Mandamin has been tested and retested. She says she is well, but she's concerned about another day.
Grandkids, great-grandkids, you know, being, maybe if it's true that that mercury is dangerous to health, then they could have deformed kids, huh? Vegetables, like in Japan. And I don't want that.
The ban on commercial fishing has, in effect, torn the guts out of the Ojibwe's economy. Josephine's husband, Isaac, has fished and fed his people all his life. Now he holds down a government job.
I had to change over to to a white man's way of living. And it took me a long time to adapt to the new culture I had to face. I had to meet my my bank payments and this and that. But before, when I was commercial fishing, it was just I was a free man. But now I'm not. I have to work for the bank.
Before the initial mercury discovery in 1970, most of the people here were fully employed. But the commercial fishing ban and the slowdown in the tourist industry put 95% of the workforce on the unemployment list. Government subsidies provide some job training and relief. Frozen meats and fish are trucked in. The captives of a government bureaucracy, the two reserves are now troubled welfare wards.
The life we lead now ever since the closure of the river has just been one hell of a thing with gas sniffing, more alcohol problems, and welfare.
So the Ojibwe could fish once again. The government offered to move Josephine and her people to cleaner waters. They refused.
Why should I? I didn't make them pollution. I had nothing to do with it. I'm just a victim. So why should I move?
Commercial fishing, though, was not the only source of revenue for the Ojibwe. Many of the people worked as guides, cooks, maids, and clerks for lodge owners Barney and Marion Lamb. With the help of the Ojibwe, the Lambs ran the largest and most successful fishing camp in Canada. The work and training they gave to these Ojibwe brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars to otherwise impoverished communities. But today, this path is a bittersweet memory lane. After the mercury announcement, the Lambs voluntarily closed their hand-built lodge operation, a business that grossed more than $1 million a year.
Well, do you invite friends over to your house and say, come on over? Now, I'm not going to eat this myself. There's just a little bit of poison. I don't think it's going to hurt you to eat this. You wouldn't do that. And that's the way we felt about it.
We knew we didn't have to eat it, and I sure didn't have to feed it to my kids. But could we send these people out every day? And that was really the decision. What made the decision was we just couldn't operate that way.
We said, tell us that it's all right to feed this fish to our guests. Tell us it's all right. If you found out something new now that you didn't know 6 months ago, tell us, and we'll open tomorrow. But we cannot operate where you tell us or where we feel that this is not safe to eat. We come in here as kids without a goddamn thing, and we built it, and there was a lot of hard work. But I can remember coming back from God's Lake and landing here in the fall, and seeing the place closed, and as we're taxiing away, tears are running down Marion's face. It was pretty tough.
And so you've got a lot of emotion into what should have been tackled as a pollution problem, as a technical, complex pollution problem. And so, to me, my advice is, after our experience here, is that we try and keep emotion out of it.
When you look out and see this beautiful scenery that, should be there for everybody to enjoy for years and years and years and years, forever. And it's ruined, for anything, really. And to me, that is not progress. They say it's progress, but I don't see it that way.
Much of the paper and pulp industry in North America is now mercury-free. But mercury is commonly used around the world to make paints, hand lotions, jewelry, dental fillings, gyroscopes, and bowling balls. The Great Lakes and 11 prime Minnesota fishing lakes have dangerously high levels of mercury in them. So do stretches of the Mississippi. And in the U.S., 28 states have ordered fishing bans, health warnings, or outright plant closings in recent years.
We're just getting closer and closer to the end if we don't stop this, and I think it's up to people. When I say people, everybody, to say, look, we've had enough. There has to be a better way.
The major source of mercury in the U.S. is the coal-fired power plant. And what complicates the mercury dilemma worldwide is that acid rain may not only carry, but also activate heavy metals, such as mercury. Acid rain, in other words, makes mercury more mobile in water and more toxic.
And so in every situation, in Canada and Sweden where you see lakes becoming acid. You see decreasing populations of organisms and increasing levels of heavy metals in the organisms. And so, even though you only have a few fish left, those fish that are left are not fit for human consumption.
It has been more than 10 years now since the Lambs closed their doors, and they have spent their time in an effort to alert Canada and the rest of the world to the hazards of mercury.
So after we've been closed for 10 years to try and reopen, and we don't see that the situation has changed. It has improved some, there's no question. But according to this report that the federal provincial people, it looks like it's reached a plateau, and it could be, quite a few more years.
But their stand has not been a popular one. Barney was hanged in effigy. Marion received crank calls, and on the verge of a breakdown, she and Barney moved their flying service and home to Winnipeg, more than 100 miles away.
When people are involved in pollution issues, I think there's bound to be emotion. On the other hand, I would hope that that emotion could be kept in the confines of the people affected and not get a whole country emotional about something that's happening somewhere, which the government, in my view, handles fairly well.
Well, I think what Barney Lamb did is most unusual, and he felt that public health was much more important than profit, than money. And as a result of that, he decided entirely on his own to take a stand. And the stand was very unpopular because all his friends fell out with him because they wanted to make money, and they decided that public health wasn't important. And furthermore, they were upset with him because he was concerned with the public health of the Indians. And they didn't care about the public health of the Indians, but he did. Now, what I would like to see is if the major chemical companies in the world, if they would have presidents of the board of directors like Barney Lamb, we'd have no trouble at all. Not the slightest problem, because they would be people who would, first of all, ask, is there a problem with the public health? And secondly, they would ask, what were the profits for last year?
Partially through the Lamb's efforts, the Dryden Mill is now building a new multi-million-dollar treatment facility. Both the former and new owners have agreed to a damage settlement limit of $15 million.
I think companies, government, everybody's beginning to realize they just can't go on and use the rivers as sewers and, spoil the environment. They're going to have to spend money. We all got to pay the price. The product's got to be more expensive to do it. But if we're going to survive, we're going to have to do it.
At White Dog and Grassy Narrows, mercury still hides in the waters. More comes with every rain, and it may take 100 years for the river to flush itself free once again. Josephine clings to an uncertain future, and Isaac's nets catch nothing but the morning sun.
It's too bad, but I guess we'll have to accept it, because you can never go back. It would be foolish. We may cry and moan about the buffalo days, but they'll never come back. It's impossible. We'll just make the best of it.
They don't really understand what kind of a society we have, that the forests are destroyed, so there's no meat, the fish is polluted, and they don't really, I don't think they really accept it yet. They know they shouldn't be eating the fish, and yet to them this is the world that God gave them, and it was for, to be used and be taken care of. And they think more of future generations, much more than white people, I think. You hear many Indians speak about that they have much more concern for generations to come as far as the natural resources. And these are all, renewable natural resources that could have been here for years and years and years, but they'll be here, I guess, but they aren't any good.
For all of us, water is a familiar substance. We were born in it. We bathe in it, swim in it, play with it, use it for rituals, and pass it around as an icy dessert. But as familiar as it may seem, water is a distant friend, a faraway relative who comes and goes too quickly, too soon. As host of this planet on which we are the guests, Water sits with us in conversation. It both wails and whispers, stirs uncomfortably, cries out and carries on, and easily offended it will on occasion rise up and slap us in the face. So water is the part of us we see but once in a while. It's the person we take for granted, rarely think about, never really listen to, assume will always be there, and won't admit we really need. And more out of guilt than genuine feeling, we'll miss it most only when it's gone. Science, technology, industrial gimmickry, legal wizardry, and moneyed agencies alone or together cannot help us now. We cannot buy a friend. We cannot bribe Mother Nature. There's no synthetic water, no nuclear water, no solar water, and whatever we cannot make, we cannot taste. So the solutions to an impending water crisis lies in our attitudes and perceptions. It's a matter of washing away the arrogance and toasting a renewed friendship. A kinship with water, buoyed by the same respect and the same care we all expect for ourselves. I'm Dave Moore.
I have a cabin up in the mountain, and all the creeks and all the streams and all the lakes are clear, cold water. I can lay down where I want to and drink. Ice, fresh water. When I come from the town and get up there in the mountain, I start a new life. Breathe the clean air and drink the clear water. That's good for me.